The second commandment says, "Thou shalt not make unto thyself a graven image." That is understood to mean that in Judaism there are no images, and especially not any sacred images. But that's not so. There are plenty of examples of sacred images in Jewish art. And if you look at the archaeological evidence, you find in a synagogue in Syria, in Dura Oropos, that dates to the 3rd century AD, not one or two images of sacred art, but an entire panorama of stories from the Bible decorating that synagogue. And when they were discovered in the 1920s, they detonated an explosion of interest in the religious and art historical community of scholars. Because here was living proof that what had been taught in the schools and universities for centuries was dead wrong. And there's something similar going on in the Islamic world. It is a simple act of faith on the part of many Muslims that Islamic art has no images. And yet, you can't open a book on Islamic art without having the images tumbling out at you. Incense burners in the forms of dragons, lions, cats, dogs, sphinxes, pottery decorated with courtiers, lovers, hunters, book painting, like what you're looking at now, which is absolutely crammed with images of people. How does this happen? What's going on? Well, the sayings of the prophet seem to suggest that the prophet Muhammad had reservations about images, as indeed did many rabbis. He is said to have said, "The angels will not enter a house where there are images or a dog." And yet, when it came to redecorating the sacred Kaaba in Mecca, and the pictures that had formerly decorated it were being whitewashed, he put his hands over an image of the Virgin Mary and the child Jesus, so that that should not be wiped out. And when his wife Aisha asked him if she could wear figured silks, have figured curtains in the house, he said, "Oh well, all right, so long as you can sit on them." And so the image of Aisha's cushion becomes a talking point for the presence of images in Islamic art. Now, none of this is to deny that there is a steady stream of disapproval, especially among the religious classes in the Islamic world, for images of any kind. If you must have images, said Al-Nawawi, then make them look like flowers. Pardon? Pardon? What does that mean? How do you make an image look like a flower? And indeed, in Ottoman art, there are lots of figures, human figures, which have flower faces. So it's neither the one thing nor the other. And of all the prohibitions that was most deep-rooted in the Islamic faith. The one that was most deeply rooted was a hostility to religious images, images of directly sacred nature. So for some 600 years after the death of the Prophet in 632, there were, it seems, no images of him, or for that matter, of any religious intent in the Islamic world. And then, as you learnt yesterday in the lecture I gave about the birth of Persian painting in the 13th and 14th centuries, there came the cataclysm of the invasion of the Eastern Islamic world by the Mongols under Chinggis Khan, coming from Mongolia as a complete nation and spreading ruin and disaster wherever they went. And when they settled in the Islamic lands, and eventually became Muslim, they did not have a prehistory that inhibited them from looking at religious images. On the contrary, the first religion that they'd encountered that was not their own animistic or shamanistic religion was Buddhism. And so in the East Asian world, they came across many religious images and got used to the idea that a religion with scriptures must also have images. So they become Muslim, and they have Jewish and Christian officials. They welcome Christian missionaries who bring their illustrated missals, psalters, gospels, and so on with them, and they look at Islam and effectively they say, well, where are your images? There are none. And so what happens in the course of the period immediately after the Mongol rulers of the Eastern Islamic world become Muslim, which happens in 1295, what happens immediately after that is that there is an extraordinary outburst of religious painting. And I suppose if I'd been an artist who was told to paint such pictures, and I didn't want to, and I was told that the alternative was to have my throat cut, I'd find a way of painting such pictures. And here are some of the earliest. Those of you who know the iconography of the Bible will recognize well enough this image of the Garden of Eden. It comes from a Byzantine octateuch, that's a manuscript of the first 8 books of the Bible, including, of course, Genesis, and it shows you the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, from which, under the persuasion of Lucifer, Eve took the apple and gave it to Adam to eat. And with the biting into the apple came the fall of man and the expulsion from paradise. They discovered their nakedness, which they covered with fig leaves. And there's the hand of God giving the message, "Hast thou eaten of the fruit of that tree which I said thou shouldest not eat?" That then is the kind of image that might have been in a Muslim library in Iran at the time that this picture was painted. It's a picture I showed some of you yesterday. It's from a book by Al-Biruni, a Central Asian polymath who lived in the 10th and early 11th centuries, and who wrote a book about the festivals of followers of Islam and of many other religions. And among those religions was the religion of Manichaeism, the dualistic religion, which taught that good and evil are equal. They are a white and a dark horse that are engaged in a race throughout eternity, with neither of them gaining an advantage. And part of the Manichaean thought world was the belief in a spirit of evil, Ahriman, who is shown here with the first man and the first woman, Misha and Mishyana, tempting them with the fruit of paradise, this time not an apple but a pomegranate. And here too, we have that same concern about nakedness and the shame that comes with nakedness. A later hand has simply rubbed out those portions of the body. Now, in the same manuscript, there's an account of Adam and Eve, this time later on in their lives, when their son Abel has been killed by his brother Cain. And his parents, Adam and Eve, are desolate, and they pray to God that he will send them back Abel, at least once a year. And so he agrees to that, and Abel comes back one night in the year to eat a meal with his parents, and that's what we're looking at here. And it's the festival associated with that event that is being illustrated here. Let's move on to the figure of Noah, Nuh, in the Islamic tradition. And here he is in his ark, reclining like some pasha in the poop, while his sons labor at the oars, and the sea is full of fish. It's an early stage of the story of the flood, because we can still see behind them a landscape. So the earth has not been completely submerged. Now you might ask, what are these images doing? What is the purpose of these images of Adam, Eve, Noah, and as we shall see, Abraham, Moses, Jonah, Joseph, and so on? What are they all doing? What is their purpose for a Muslim audience? And here there is a double purpose. First, there is the exemplary nature of these prophets. They illustrate God's power to come to the rescue of those who earnestly believe in him. Whatever the danger, Abraham being cast into the fire, Noah menaced by a flood, Joseph falsely accused of seducing his master's wife, whatever the trouble therein, God will intervene and save them. And that is a moral lesson for any human being in later times, wondering what they should do when they are up against a difficult moral choice. So, number one is the exemplary nature of these prophets' lives. But the other part of the equation is that this is part of the grand tapestry of the history of mankind. So, a history of the world, and this is equally true if we look at the Jewish tradition, the Islamic tradition, or the Christian tradition. The history of the world will always begin with the history of the prophets. The men of God who in ancient times heard his message and passed it on to their contemporaries. So it's salvation history with an immediate relevance to the people who are listening to that message in this day and age, in their own day and age. Now, if we look more carefully at the image of Noah and his family, we see the total absence of the animals that are part of the accepted Christian iconography. of this story. There are no women there. And it's a relatively small boat. In all these ways, it's a very different iconographic tradition. And this is the moment to underline that the Islamic version of the stories that we have in the Bible and sub-stories that develop from those have different sources from simply the Old Testament. They plundered the Talmud and the Mishnah, the commentaries on the books of the Bible that were carried out by Jewish rabbis over many centuries, and then they enlarged that with their own commentaries on the commentaries. So we get an entire language, an entire literature of the history of the prophets, which can take us a long way from the stories of the prophets that we know from the books of the Bible as it is currently put together. And this is an example. No real attempt to confront the totality of the flood story, the saving of all living things on the earth. It is as if it had turned into a pleasure cruise. Let's move on to the story of Abraham. Abraham, known in the Islamic tradition as Khalilullah, the friend of God, the father of faith. And at the top we see an image that we know from the Bible, and at the bottom one that we do not know from the Bible. The top one is the Old Testament Annunciation. We remember the story of Abraham pitching his tent in an oasis. He's sitting enjoying the view when he sees three strangers approach. He hurries into the tent and tells his wife Sarah to bake some cakes and to slaughter a calf for the guests. He then goes out and talks to them, and they predict to him, they are angels sent from God, they predict to him that he is about to become the father of a child. And at this stage, he's over 100, and Sarah is over 90, and she's listening by the fold of the tent, and she starts to snigger. Me, at age 90, have a child? That's ridiculous. And she laughs. And the angels say, you shall name him, he who laughs, Ishaq, Isaac. And of course, 9 months later, he is born. Here we see Sarah, not exactly 90 years old, a lady of fashion, looking at a mirror with her maid beside her, and then the dividing textile of the tent door before Abraham is shown entertaining the three angels. This gives us another insight into a particularly Christian use of the stories of the Old Testament prophets, that they foretold what would happen in future times. And in this case, it's not just the foretelling of the birth of Isaac, but it is a preview, a prequel of the Annunciation to Mary and the birth of Jesus. That is how Christian theologians interpreted this scene. Let's look at the scene below, and clearly there's a villain in it because his face has been rubbed out. This is the pagan king Nimrod, who commanded Abraham to worship his God. Abraham refused to do so, saying there was only one God. This is one of the reasons why Abraham is particularly venerated in the Muslim tradition, because he was so steadfast in his belief that there was only one God. God was one, not many. Nimrod thereupon brings a catapult and has him flung into a fiery furnace. Now, obviously, there's some sort of connection here with the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the three Hebrews in the fiery furnace in the time of Daniel. And that kind of cross-fertilization of ideas and iconography is commonplace in this body of material, the stories of the prophets. So there is the fiery furnace, and Abraham is catapulted into the middle of it, his hands raised in prayer, and God turns it all into a sunlit meadow, sparkling with flowers, and as cool as a cucumber. There's Abraham then, raising his hands in prayer to God who has delivered him. That same theme of God delivering his children in time of trouble. This is exactly the foundation of the earliest Christian iconography in the catacombs of Rome, where repeatedly we have the images of the three Hebrews in the fire, Daniel in the lion's den, Jonah and the whale. These images of rescue, of salvation at the critical moment. This is not just history, it's also salvation history. There is a moral there for those with eyes to see and ears to hear. You'll recognize the other image, also of Abraham, and these, by the way, are both from the same manuscript, an anthology of Islamic literary texts currently held in Lisbon in the Gulbenkian Museum, made probably in Isfahan in central Iran in 1411 for Sultan Iskandar. It shows Abraham about to sacrifice his son Isaac, whom he's blindfolded. He's about to cut his throat when the angel comes and presents the ram who will be sacrificed in his stead. And there are a series of witnesses. For this is a theophany, a manifestation of God to man. And as such, it needs witnesses to its truth. So here are these four angels who witness the event and proclaim its truth. Abraham makes another appearance in the manuscript of Al-Biruni of 1307, made in Tabriz, in all probability, in northwest Iran. And here he is in the Sabaean city of Haran. Haran is a city in southeastern Turkey now. And in the Middle Ages, up to about the 11th century, it was a city of astroloters, that is to say, people who worshipped the heavenly bodies, the moon, the sun, and the stars. And they had their own scripture, and according to Islamic law, they were people of the book, and so they were allowed to keep their faith and to build their temples. And in fact, some of their temples have been found in Haran, have been excavated, and have been found to have images of the moon, the sun, and the stars carved on their pavements. Now, Abraham, according to Al-Biruni, visited the temple of the Sabaeans and, affronted by their idols, destroyed them. And that is the apparent subject of this image. But look more carefully and you'll see that these are not images of the sun, the moon, and the stars, but images that have a suspiciously familiar look. The black ones are oxidized silver. The yellow ones are gilded. and you have only to look at the shaven head, the enigmatic smile, the almond eyes, the capacious, well-apportioned belly, and the hands in the various mudra positions, to realize that what we're looking at is the destruction of Buddhist images, not Sabaean ones at all. And this has an absolutely up-to-date relevance in this particular manuscript. For this manuscript was made in 1307, and in 1304 there was a violent persecution of all Buddhists in Iran. And their temples were destroyed, their statues were destroyed, their tankas were burned, and they were simply effaced from the land. And this, after a succession of Mongol rulers had professed and followed Buddhism, had had Buddhist teachers, had built Buddhist temples, and so on. So the conversion to Islam of 1295 was a prelude to a violent persecution of Buddhists, which is exactly what is alluded to here. In other words, a text that is 300 years old and was written with quite different intentions has been brought right up to date and given a very pointed significance, an anti-Buddhist significance in a time of the persecution of Buddhists under the early Mongols. And if we look more carefully, we'll see that Abraham is presented as a card-carrying Arab. Note that he has his chin strap under his chin, which is the Arab fashion of the time, and that he wears long, baggy pantaloons under his mantle. And if you look more carefully at the textiles behind him, the looped curtains and the decoration of the segmental arch, here's the segmental arch, you'll see that it's full of Far Eastern echoes. Chrysanthemums, peonies, and other flowers that don't figure in Iranian iconography before that meeting with the visual arts of China that characterized the period around 1300. Let's move on to the story of Joseph. And I make no apology for this exceedingly ripe version of the story, which we see in an Egyptian poster, which does not use understatement, where it can use direct, unmistakable sensuality. What do we see here? It is the story of Joseph being tempted by Potiphar's wife, as we learn in Genesis 42. And some modern Egyptian artist, this was done about 1970 or so, some modern Egyptian artist familiar with the iconography of the tourist trade has given her an Egyptian headdress, but has made her a kind of Egyptian Marilyn Monroe, and her charms leave nothing to the imagination. Joseph holds out his hands in horror, and she is tearing his garment from behind. This is going to be the proof when her husband, affronted, draws aside the curtain, that she is lying when she says that he was trying to seduce her. Look at her hand pointing to the bed. And in case there should be any other doubt, we have here a shahid, the witness. The witness is the baby in his cot, who sees the whole thing. I don't know that the baby was able to give a fairly accurate legal description of what happened, but he's there anyway. And here we have Yusuf, on him be peace, so that we don't have any doubt about who it is, and Zuleika, identified also by an inscription above her. And you'll see here and there various pharaonic bits and pieces, the supports of the table, the ankh on the table, the royal scepter, the figure of Anubis, etc., etc. There's no lack of corroborative ancient Egyptian detail. But this is a modern poster for use in a modern Egyptian house, because the story of Joseph still has resonances. It's still an important story about ethical conduct, the dangers of giving false witness, the wiles of women, the need to listen to God. This is exemplary, and it's exemplary in the language of today, and that's why I don't give any apology for showing it to you. But of course, there are much more ancient versions of the story of Joseph, and perhaps none is more of a masterpiece than this one. It is from a manuscript of the Bustan, the orchard, by the Persian poet Sa'di, and it dates to 1488 and was made in western Afghanistan, in Herat, by perhaps the greatest of all Persian painters, Behzad. It's an interesting story. It tells the story of how Potiphar's wife, Zuleika, tried to seduce Joseph by leading him to a palace that she had built. And this palace has 7 rooms. And in each room, there were a series of erotic pictures showing Yusuf and Zuleika together. And she led him from one room to the next. And each time he had got into the room, the door clanged shut behind him. It was a labyrinth, and very quickly he lost his bearings. In each room she propositioned him. In each room he declined. Finally, they reached the last room. In an access of desperation, she made a passionate lunge at him. He tore away from her and threw up his arms in prayer. She said, "Come on, give in. No one's looking." So he says, "But God is looking. God is looking." And he sends forth a heartfelt prayer for delivery. And at that moment, the doors swing open and he escapes. Now look at what happens. Look at the text. The text answers him, answers his prayer. And in this room alone, with its white wall, Joseph is safe. At the ultimate moment, at the most challenging moment, God intervenes. Now, the story in Sa'di's Bustan is very, very short. It's elusive, like so many of these stories of the prophet, where effectively we're told, and this is very often found in the Qur'an itself, you know about the story of Abraham and how he almost sacrificed his son. And that's all that we hear. You know the story of Joseph and how he escaped that woman. The Qur'an expects you to know the story already. These were obviously stories that were widespread, that were common currency at the time that the Qur'an was revealed in the 7th century. And similarly, Sa'di, when he tells this story, tells it in the most abbreviated way. But what we're looking at, what the picture describes, is an extended account of Joseph and Zuleika from the poet Jami, whose Yusuf and Zuleika poem was his great masterpiece, and he was a poet of the late 15th century, living, as it happens, in Herat, the court poet. So although the text says one thing, the pictures are all taken from the much more extensive story of Joseph and Zuleika, as told by Jami. And you can see in the image before you how the idea of Joseph as a white laboratory rat trapped in a series of trapdoors, unable to escape, disoriented, confused, is brought to life in this complex, Escher-like architectural framework, where once you analyze it, it doesn't make sense. The planes don't meet, but they don't need to. You understand the story well enough. And in case you didn't get it first time, there's even color symbolism at work. For Zuleika wears the color of passion, which is uniformly red, scarlet, vermilion. And Joseph, wears the Islamic color of holiness, green. And behind him, the whiteness that signifies the unity of God. It's a very elaborate, very complex visual riff on the story. The text itself only tells you there was a pavilion with many, many rooms. It doesn't talk to you about these zigzagging staircases and conflicting spaces. Now, at another stage of the story, Zuleika is mocked by the ladies of Egypt for her infatuation with her male slave. And so she decides to have her revenge. And she invites them all to a party. And she gives each of them a very sharp knife and a bowl of oranges in front of them. And they start peeling the oranges, preparatory to eating them. And at a key moment, she gives a sign, and the door opens, and in strides this well-toned hunk, Joseph. And they take one look at him, and their jaws drop, and their hands continue to peel, but now they're peeling their own hands, and they're covered in blood. And that's the scene that you're treated to there. In a manuscript, the same manuscript of 1411 that I showed you before. The story continues, though. In the Islamic version of the story of Joseph, it is actually Zuleika, Potiphar's wife, who buys Joseph at the slave market, not Potiphar himself. And eventually, when her attempt to incriminate him fails, he is set free and becomes the vizier of the king of Egypt, of Pharaoh. And Zuleika is cast out by her husband and reduced to penury. And years later, he passes by her and sees her by the roadside, and she's become blind and is a beggar woman. And that's what we're looking at there. She holds out her hand to him, and he wears, as you can see, a Buddhist halo, a fire halo, yet another example of the way that the iconography of the Middle East was invaded by Far Eastern iconographic conventions. Not a soup plate halo, but a fiery halo. And he also has a canopy held over his head to indicate that he's a person of consequence. He passes by and greets her, and later on, he has her brought before him. And she has learnt her lesson. She has become pious. And you can see that she now holds a rosary. She has a dowager's hump and a walking stick, while Joseph's beauty is still what it was. And at this point, the story takes a leap into fantasy, because as she acknowledges her sin and acknowledges that God is one, God is merciful to her and restores to her all her former beauty, and they are married. I do like feel-good films. Let's move on to the story of Jonah. Jonah, who is called by God to preach to the sinful citizens of Nineveh in Iraq, and says, I don't think so. And in order to escape from God, he rushes to the nearest seaport, Tarsus, and takes a ship to get away from God. Imagine that, getting away from God. A storm brews up. In this story, it is exactly the same as the biblical story. The sailors cast him overboard because he admits that the storm has come because of his disobedience to God. And they say, well, please excuse us, but we have to get rid of you, otherwise we'll all die. And he says, yes, that's fair enough. And they cast him overboard, and he enters the belly of a great fish. And there he stays for 3 days and nights meditating, praying to God, who saves him once again. And the fish vomits him up onto dry ground, and that's what we're seeing here. Now, clearly, the artist has looked at images of Chinese dragons and has used that as a model for the great fish. This is an image from the World History of Rashid ad-Din of 1314, made in Tabriz. And it is exactly the same kind of image as we find in contemporary Christian images. Here's one made in Cilicia by Toros Roslin, an Armenian manuscript illuminator, where he's actually vomited out into our world. You notice that the fish largely stays in the frame, but Jonah doesn't. And that has a purpose. That indicates that this is relevant to us, because the area inside the frame is the story, the area outside the frame is our world. So he's in our world, and he's therefore for us to look at and to learn from. But in another manuscript, another portion of the same manuscript of 1314 of the world history, we see him, and this is an image some of you saw yesterday, we see him already on shore, and he's resting under a gourd which God has caused to grow and give him shade from the merciless sun, while the fish simply looks at him impassively as it swishes its tail in this extraordinary detailed recreation of a rippling, eddying, whirlpool-filled expanse of water, all borrowed from Chinese studies of water, of which there were numerous examples made in the 13th century. And one of those was clearly made its way westwards and was copied by this artist. let's move on to the story of Samson. Samson, a Nazarite who never cut his hair, never shaved, until he fell in with Delilah, and she persuaded him to tell the story of his strength, the source of his strength, and while he slept, bound him and cut his hair, so that he became powerless to resist the Philistines when they came for him. They blinded him, they put him to work in the mill, and then they brought him out to jeer at him at a time of a great festival to their god Dagon. And the temple of Dagon is shown as a kind of Chinese structure with hipped eaves and a wooden skylight resting on pillars made of baked brick in the Iranian fashion. So a very curious combination there of Chinese and Iranian architecture. Samson, as the story tells us, grasps the two strongest pillars in the temple and prays God for strength. God grants him strength, and he pulls the pillars apart and is killed as the roof falls, but so are 3,000 Philistines. And we see their heads dotted here and there in the image. This is from the world history of Rashid ad-Din of 1314. Now, what's of interest here is that the artist has made a very serious blunder. The whole point of the story is that Samson's strength resides in his hair. And when his hair is cut, when he's shaved, he is as weak as any man. But when his hair grows, with it there grows his strength. And the artist, by making him a Muslim and giving him a turban, has lost the whole point of the story. Because we should have Samson, as he is shown in illustrated Byzantine manuscripts, for example, with long hair. His strength is back. Here we don't see his hair at all. Staying, or rather going back to the story of the treatment of the Jews and Jewish history in the chronology of Al-Biruni, a manuscript you've seen several images of. The one on the top illustrates the loss of the Ark of the Covenant, which I spoke about yesterday, so I won't go into that in detail now, except to point out that the artist has had an attempt at recreating a Torah shrine, but giving it Chinese-influenced terminals. Look at them, up there and there, and a decoration of arabesques alongside an attempt to recreate the Hebrew script. More interesting, perhaps, is the bigger image, which shows Nebuchadnezzar, Bucht-Nassar, giving the order to his henchmen, and you notice that they've had their faces rubbed out, as has he, giving the order to destroy the temple in Jerusalem. So two great disasters for the Jewish nation are singled out as the only illustrations from Jewish Old Testament history to be illustrated in this book. And just as we have that attack on Buddhism in the image of Abraham destroying the temple of the Sabians that I showed you earlier with all those Buddhist statues. So here we have an attack on the Jews who had been great in the land until the Mongols converted to Islam. And when they converted to Islam in 1295, both Christians and Jews suffered and were persecuted, lost their property, and had their places of worship plundered and destroyed. So this too has, for all that it seems to illustrate an event that happened in 587 BC, has an up-to-date relevance in 1307 in northwest Iran. Let's have a closer look. The descriptions of the temple in the Book of Kings and elsewhere are very, very detailed, and it certainly didn't look like this. But what does look like this is the Dome of the Rock, which to Muslims would be exactly where the Temple of Solomon was, and perhaps the Temple of Solomon looked like the Dome of the Rock. We're not talking archaeology here, we're not talking facts, we're talking fantasy. And the inscription says, Beit al-Muqaddas, the holy house, which is indeed a fair description of the Dome of the Rock. And you see the tongues of fire licking away at it. You see the idea of a dome. You see the idea of a ring of columns supporting the dome, just as in the Dome of the Rock, and even the presence of an iron grill, such as the Dome of the Rock did indeed have in the 14th century. So the person who painted this certainly had some knowledge of what the Dome of the Rock looked like. Notice then the interplay between the modern and the biblical. The two feed off each other. Let's move on to the story of Moses. And in the world history of 1314, Moses has a particular position of importance to judge by the number of images that are devoted to his story. And this is the place to explain that. Moses was a great leader of the Jewish people. Rashid ad-Din, who wrote this history and who was the prime minister of the Mongols, who commissioned the history, was himself Jewish. And we may perhaps see here an attempt to encourage the Jewish community on the part of Rashid ad-Din, their most eminent representative, for all that he had converted to Islam, and that he saw himself, in some sense, as a leader of his people, an inspirer of his people. And that doesn't exclude an entirely different interpretation, which would be to see Moses as a warrior prophet, exactly as Muhammad was. A prophet who led his people through difficult times, fought battles with their enemies and overcame them, and brought them into a place of safety. In this case, the Promised Land. In the case of Muhammad himself, the community of Islam. So there are several strands at work here. There's the obvious strand of simply telling the Old Testament story with additions from the Jewish commentaries and the Muslim commentaries on those Jewish commentaries. Then there's the strand of Rashid ad-Din himself with his identification with Moses as a leader of his people, and finally the identification with Muhammad. Several things going on at once. Let's look at the images themselves. Top one shows Muhammad being, what am I talking about? Moses being propelled down a raging torrent. This is the Nile, as Pharaoh's daughter comes down to the riverside to wash, and I hope that she will be in time to catch him before the river passes him beyond her reach. And we see his sister Miriam casting an anxious eye at the coffin that holds the baby, rushing past. The further one down shows Moses on the mountain of fire and smoke, Sinai, surrounded by the elders of Israel, all of them tonsured, bald-headed, all of them asleep, while he communes with God. It's a mountain of smoke. Here are all the images of smoky clouds done in a Chinese convention, and Moses has his hands outstretched in prayer. Now, there are two separate sources for this image. One is an image of lohans, that's Chinese monks, sleeping on the ground, and this would account for the shaven heads and the monkish robes that the elders of Israel are wearing. And it would also account for the Chinese elements in the mountain itself and in the clouds and the rocks around. But another possibility is to see this as a reworking of a familiar Christian scene, namely the agony in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus, on the night before his crucifixion, prays passionately to God while his disciples are all asleep around him. And this kind of multivalent iconography is typical of this manuscript of the world history, whose artists were working under severe constraints of time. They had to produce lots of pictures in a very short time, and they took ideas from wherever they could find them. And so they plunder Christian manuscripts, they plundered Chinese objets d'art, and make the most unexpected connections. Here we have Pharaoh, seen as an Islamic monument, as an Islamic monarch, and here are the magicians of Pharaoh, one black, one red-faced, and here's Moses, and he is brought before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says, "Why should I listen to you? What's so special about you?" So Moses takes his staff and turns it into a dragon, into a serpent that eats up the animals created by Pharaoh's magicians. And those are the images that you're looking at. Top right is an early 14th century, and the left-hand one is a 16th century version of that story. Let's move on to the crossing of the Red Sea. You all know the story. Perhaps you saw Charlton Heston in the role of Moses. "Let my people go." Here we see the extreme reluctance of the painters to go beyond models that they can lay their hands on. The model below is from a Byzantine octateuch. It shows Moses as a young man with a halo, surrounded by his people, and his wonder-working staff brings the waters rushing back to engulf the army of Pharaoh. And the river god, we have this curious use of antique river gods. The river god pulls the Egyptians from their horses and chariots to drown them. And this is happening at night, because we see the figure of night holding a robe, or a scarf rather, over her head, and that is the personification of Nux, night, in Byzantine iconography. So that's the model that was chosen for the world history. He simply transposes it from left to right, and he gives Moses a rayed halo, which is exceptional, but otherwise it's a fair recreation of what we see in the Byzantine model. And that is carried into another context when we come to the story of a rebellion against Moses by Korah and his tribe, who say, "Why should you hold the priesthood? Why can't we?" And Moses says, because God gave me the priesthood and he didn't give it to you. And he advises all the Israelites to get away from Korah as quickly as possible because disaster is going to strike. And then indeed it does strike. The ground splits into fissures in front of them and swallows them whole. And Korah is dragged down to his death, still cursing Moses. And we can see some of them, just a despairing hand at the bottom right, and a few heads as they sink down to their doom, including all their wealth. But that is basically the same arrangement as the crossing of the Red Sea, the reuse of an iconographic formula for a different story. Now we come to a story that concerns Moses, but is only in the commentaries, not in our Bible. It's about Og, the king of Bashan, whose bed was preserved in a museum in Amman, according to the Bible, and was an iron bedstead that held a man over 13 feet high. So this king of Bashan, Og, the king of the giants, attacked the Israelite camp with an enormous rock to throw at them, and God sent a flock of sparrows to peck a hole in the rock. It fell over his neck. He overbalanced and broke his neck as Moses reached up to hit him on the ankle. And here we have Moses hitting him on the ankle, and there's the gigantic figure of Og. And we see the same thing here, a little more realistic. And it's become a much more multi-layered image, because we see here the figure of Bilal, one of the earliest Muslims who was the first person who made the call to prayer. He was an Abyssinian, a black Abyssinian. And we see Muhammad surrounded by his family enthroned below. So it's an image that crosses gulfs of space and time. Not so the image of the same scene in the world history of Rashid ad-Din, where in what is, I'm sure by an effect of humor, the smallest picture in the whole manuscript, we see the largest figure, the fallen giant who's fallen topsy-turvy, cracked his head open, and there's Moses holding his staff, watching his discomfiture. And we'll see that Moses is very much smaller, of course, than the giant, but the giant's foot takes up the top right, and the giant's head the top left. So he's totally imprisoned in a very small picture space. And we have here another version of the same scene. So in all of these images, we see the Islamic artist responding enthusiastically to the element of fantasy in this whole story. So far, I've concentrated almost entirely on the Old Testament, but there are images of the New Testament stories, and there are two of them in the Biruni manuscript and one in Rashid ad-Din's manuscript, and I'll close with those. This is an image of the Annunciation. It shows the angel Gabriel as a denizen, not of Judea, but of East Asia. Look at his flame halo of Buddhist type, his almond eyes, his arched eyebrows, the moon face, the rhetorical flourish of his drapery. He's like one of those tomb figures that you see at Don Juan. And the Virgin Mary herself is spinning the skein of purple wool used for the temple curtain as she sits under a Muslim ogee arch with a mock Kufic Arabic inscription above her. You couldn't find a more multicultural version of the Annunciation if you tried. And here, around the very same time, exactly the same scene, shown in a totally different way, where the angel is now a man, as indeed the biblical account tells us, and Mary, this follows the account in one of the apocryphal Gospels, is on her way to the well to fill her water jug. There's the well, and in a gesture of modesty, she lays her hand across her cheek as the angel greets her with his Hail Mary. And the background, as you can see, is one of Chinese-inspired mountains in sepia tones with multiple different planes. Another image, I showed this yesterday, shows Muhammad and Jesus, Muhammad on a camel, Jesus on a donkey, illustrating a text from the book of Isaiah, but I won't linger on that, or on this image of the Annunciation to Mary in a Byzantine mosaic, bottom right, copied as the angel approaching Muhammad with the first revelation. Again, we have that background of Chinese mountains. The image of Muhammad being born with his uncle. This takes up the figure of Joseph in a Byzantine nativity. His uncle Abdul Muttalib, because Muhammad was a posthumous child, his father died, and here is his mother and the baby Muhammad. It's very obviously taken from a Byzantine nativity. This is a little bit more interesting, perhaps. It's an image of the story of Muhammad as a child going with a caravan of merchants to Syria to sell their wares. And they camp outside a monastery in whose tower there lives a Christian hermit. And as they are about to pass by, he says, "There is a prophet among you." And so one after another, the merchants parade before him. And he says, "No, it's not you, it's not you, it's not you." And finally, the last of the merchants has been paraded. And the monk says, "Is there no one else?" And they say, "Well, there's the boy that we left looking after the camels. Bring him," he says. And the minute he sees him, he says, "That's the one." And you actually see that gesture, that's the one. And even the camels seem to be bowing down before him. And I have a feeling that what we're looking at is a Muslim recreation of a baptismal scene, where Jesus is baptized by John the Baptist. There is the figure of the dove, the hand from heaven, the voice from heaven, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased, hear ye him." And in the same way, we have an angel coming down from heaven, anointing the prophet's head with oil, and the scroll is presumably the Qur'an. And the cloud of witnesses is now the set of merchants. So again, a reuse of a Christian scene, quite differently intended for an image of Muhammad. And I'll end with this image, which I suppose you'll all recognize as obviously the baptism. But is it? And isn't it peculiar? First of all, John the Baptist is meant to be a man of ascetic tastes. He certainly doesn't wear Armani. This man is a fashion plate, with his velvet scarf, his decorated purple robe, his smart boots. And he's meant to be baptizing Jesus, not helping him on with his clothes. And the baptismal dove has turned into a mandarin duck and is late. What on earth is going on here? I think what we're looking at is a so-called baptism, but the significance of the scene within Christian theology, a theophany, a manifestation of God to man, has drained away. And we're looking at the moment afterwards, which simply becomes a scene of a well-dressed man helping a half-naked man into his clothes while his slippers float downstream. There's an understanding here of what the Christian scene means and an unwillingness to show it with its full theological impact. So when it came to Old Testament scenes, the Muslim painter was happy to improvise and was happy to copy. When it came to certain New Testament scenes, the ground was much more dangerous, and it called for far more circumspection. And so we have this rather ambiguous treatment of what ought to be a familiar baptismal scene. I'll stop there and take questions.